Protocol 18. Rohan wiped liquid from his brow. He didn't know it was blood at first, because he couldn't see, but it was floating in globules around his face. There was a deep, worrying pain at the back of his head and more pain in his shoulders. His surroundings were pretty much in total darkness, save for the periodic blinking of red letters on the navigation screen in front of him. Warning, it read. Warning of what? Rohan wondered to himself. He'd only just regained consciousness, and he had no memory of why he had blacked out or what had happened to the vessel he was in. The vessel in question was the Shining Spear, and he knew he was its pilot. But where the ship was or what it was doing, there was a blank. He righted himself in his seat and wiped away more of the blood from his face. His head was pounding, he was dizzy, and the world around him moved in swaying motions that made him feel confused and nauseous. He watched the warning message blink a few more times when suddenly he had a flash of memory. His eyes widened, and as he tried to push aside the pain and confusion, he began to grasp onto some of the foggily forming information. There was some kind of accident or sabotage. Something affected the ship's power grid. He knew he'd been piloting the ship and then something happened. Something that caused him to hit his head right before all the lights went out. What was it, though? The view screen was black. There were no gentle vibrations from the hum of the engines, or even the sound of the ship's electronics, which usually gave off various clicks, blips, and beeps as the computer mainframe processed billions of pieces of data every second through thousands of cables and microchips embedded into her inner hull. Ah, the ship's computer. Rohan remembered the ship's AI interface. The ship's computer was so advanced it meant that the spear could travel into deep space and run hundreds of experiments with just a skeleton crew. The corporation designed their science vessels that way so that it kept costs down to a minimum. He had remembered the AI and he remembered it had an audio interface, but the prompt word was something specific that currently eluded him. Somebody's name? A place? A number maybe? L-A-11-N 11, respond. Nothing. Rohan thought he had it, but doubted himself now. Was the AI offline or was his concussed brain giving him the wrong information? He tried to think, to concentrate even more. 11 did seem an unwise word for the prompt. Any number would be on a science vessel. Most of the research staff only spoke in numbers half the time, in digits, degrees, etc., while announcing various gauge readings or discussing mathematical formulae. No, it couldn't be a number, but something like a number. What sounds like the number 11? It was on the tip of his tongue when a stabbing pain in the center of his head made him reel backwards into his chair. He thought he was going to pass out again. The practical problems of remembering what happened and getting the ship powered up again were now superseded with the immediate concerns for his mortal well-being. He pawed tentatively at the back of his head, through the stiff blood-matted hair where there was a deep gash and now an emerging lump. The pain from it was almost unbearable. It rippled out like waves from the top of his head to the base of his neck, down through his spine and into his lower back. His head hurt. His back hurt. His arms and legs felt stiff and bruised. He hadn't just suffered a slight bump to his cranium. He felt like he'd been in a serious crash. A single thought rose up out of the quagmire of pain he was in. That thought was, get to the medical facilities. Despite the pain and wooziness, Rohan pushed himself up, away, and tipped forward as the full effect of zero gravity took hold of his body. Now he was removed from the anchor of the pilot's chair. He was off balance and tumbling. Something small and hard bounced off his left shoulder. A coffee cup, maybe. He was peering into the darkness where he could see faint outlines of the immediate surroundings. Every few seconds, the warning message lit up the bridge in red and was just enough for him to pull himself forward and maneuver along towards the exit to the main hallway that connected the bridge to the rest of the ship. When he reached the doors, they were jammed closed. The power outage meant the motion detectors were offline, so he had to slowly pull one door open with brute force, while fighting to not rotate away because of the lack of gravity. It was difficult for him, but in a cumbersome series of pulls and shoves, he managed to get the left side door open enough that he could fit through. He saw the bridge faintly lit in red briefly one last time as he struggled, wriggling himself into the pitch-black darkness of the corridor. Warning, he thought. Warning of what? In several stops and starts and half-controlled rolls, he blundered his way into and then down the main hallway. He pushed himself sideways to the right, where he roughly knew the entrance to the medical facility was situated. His hands were reaching out to feel for a surface to help guide his motion, but there were no lights to be able to navigate there reliably. Not even the dim red pulse from the console on the bridge was there to provide some helpful illumination. It was total darkness. After what seemed like forever, he eventually floated, half-twisted to land and rest on the far side of the passageway. His hands came down behind him to feel the coldness of the steel paneling that comprised the walls and the smooth curves of the fiber-carbon storage drawer handles where equipment and clothing were stowed. Taking a brief rest and catching his breath, he estimated that one big push off the wall in the direction he was facing should sail him into the medical bay. Why aren't the emergency lights on? A drifting thought occurred to him as he readied to push off. The life support was still functioning because he could breathe, and although cold, the ship wasn't freezing. Why is there no sound? Did my eardrums rupture? More clutching at thoughts as he felt his awareness finally offering some clarity. He pushed himself forward. Something briefly caught his right arm as he headed through the medbay entrance, and he barreled to the left, although his forward momentum did not change. Now he was traveling backwards and he was spinning upside down. He landed hard against some medical cabinets and banged his knee on the desk below as he failed to bring himself to a gentle stop. A lightning bolt of fresh pain ran from his knee up his left thigh and mingled in with the pain from his head and down his spine. He came to a rest, desperately feeling around for anything to grasp onto and reorient himself. There was a frantic need to find the medical supplies. He was sure he was losing too much blood, and he was becoming exhausted. I have a flashlight, he cursed to himself. Rohan's mind surged as the synapses that formed his memories were returning to an active state. He only now remembered he had a flashlight built into his flight suit. He could have saved himself so much trouble and pain if he had just remembered his flashlight. Not his fault. A great blow to the head will do that. It seemed like a miracle he was able to think at all. He reached up to his left shoulder with his right hand, causing him to momentarily rotate away from the cabinets. Hitting the pressure touch button, a small but piercing LED light switched on and the room was flooded with light. Rohan wished he'd kept the light off. Oh God! Oh God! Oh God! Oh God! His breathing quickened, his eyes staring at the impossible. All the pain in his body was temporarily forgotten as he attempted to understand the vision of twisted flesh that lay before him. Tears welled up in his eyes and he could feel a scream form inside his throat, but he made no sound. In front of him was a nightmare of contorted bodies. What at first looked like some kind of upturned spider of gigantic proportions on closer inspection were the bodies of the rest of the crew of the Spear. Not bodies, a body. Some kind of nightmare gestalt with each mangled person joined together at the back and head, while legs and arms floated limply away from the main bulk of the spider thing. Something metallic was attached to the monster like a crooked abdomen. Several cables and silver tubes were attached to it and an oil-like fluid was seeping from them. It looked like it was bleeding black spheres of its own blood into the room. There were signs of chaos and damage everywhere. Broken tables, crushed equipment, and medical implements strewn all around, gently floating and spinning on their own axes. Rohan was becoming aware of a terrible stench emanating from the creature. It was familiar like burnt popcorn, but also unfamiliar. It made him think of rotting meat and the acrid sting of vomit. He fought back his gag reflex and swallowed. What happened? What the fuck? What the... He was trying to accept what he was seeing. He didn't know what he was seeing. Are they... dead? Rohan thought as he tried to not give in to shock. He wondered if any of them were still alive. He soon got an answer. Roha-shan. One of the mouths in the gestalt head was opening and closing again. A faint, raspy voice was trying to say his name, but he could barely hear anything. Several sets of eyes on various heads shifted and were looking directly at him. Protocol A, 8 teen. Rohan noticed the mouth moving and realized it belonged to the head of his friend Harry. Dr. Harold Ferdman was a portly, amiable man who was the chief scientist that Lauhu Industries had hired to head up their deep space research division. He was also Rohan's regular lunch buddy. He was someone who enjoyed cracking jokes and talking excitedly about the latest innovations he was working on. He was fear, and revulsion prevented Rohan from doing anything. He was frozen in place. In time, even. They were still alive, or at least Harry was. But what could he do? What even was this? Harry's mouth began moving again. Protocol, all 8. Now. Rohan recognized one of the words being mouthed. At least he thought he did. It was 8 or 18. He didn't want to move any closer, but he dared lean forward just a little to hear better. He knew that there's only one thing that numbers could reference for an incident like this. One of the emergency protocols. Each mission had its own set of protocols to deal with a severe situation should something go wrong. Something had gone wrong. Horribly wrong. Essentially, the protocols were a way to hand over control of the ship to its central AI, which could then take the most appropriate action in response to any given incident. The corporation was involved in some of the most dangerous and leading-edge research humanity had ever engaged in. Fail-safes for every eventuality had to be planned out and prepared for. Harry, oh buddy, which protocol, 8 or 18? Rohan spoke the words, but couldn't hear them well. He could hardly bear to keep looking at the state of his friend either. The whole mass suddenly twitched several of its limbs before letting them relax, like a dying, thrashing insect. Harry. It seemed to pause and draw in a deep breath before moving its mouth. Again. 18. This time it was clear. It was 18. Harry. It closed his eyes, seemingly exhausted. The other eyes were still looking directly at Rohan, and some of the mouths formed raspy, haunting wails. It was difficult to tell if those strained voices were pleading with or warning him. Rohan turned away from the monstrosity, and now that he could see clearly with his chest-mounted light, he was able to grab a medical emergency kit from one of the cabinets. Pressing a med gel against the open wound on his head, he pulled himself with his left arm toward the computer console by the med bay entrance and tapped on the keypad. No response. The power still needed to be turned back on. Everything was dead except for basic life support. Even the lights were dead. Even the crew were. Popping a pain pill from the med kit, he resolved to make his way to engineering to see if he could get the Spears engines restarted. Now that he had his flashlight switched on, he made relatively quick progress other than pausing once or twice when the pain in his knee, head, or spine suddenly flared up. The pain pill was helping, he thought. Was it? He wasn't sure, but his arms and legs felt ever more numb as time passed. After making his way down the engineering corridor and into the main engineering room, he looked around for any signs of life, but there weren't any. He called out, but he heard nothing. Rohan had studied engineering as part of his 2-year orientation before going on his first space mission. He had a basic understanding of how everything worked, but not the expertise to really fix anything. He was hoping the engines just needed to be powered up, that there was no actual damage. Not that it had been anything like in these dire circumstances. But the engines had gone out a couple of times before during previous missions. He remembered that much. It was the nature of the company's science vessels that sometimes a huge amount of energy was needed to conduct one of their cutting-edge experiments. If enough energy was drawn from the engines, it could cause them to power down for a few minutes while the fuel cells refilled at a safe rate. He'd never known the engines to go offline for this long, though. The power drain must have been immense. He did recall the installation of several new pieces of tech before the latest mission, and at the time he had been concerned about the incredible power drains that happened during tests. Harry referred to something called a Lansdowne multi-phase shifter, and wittered on about it whenever they met for lunch. The crew took to calling it the meat shifter for short, and Harry would enthusiastically explain some breakthrough or other with how much organic material he had been able to successfully transport using the device. They'd been conducting smaller-scale experiments with lab rats for days, before eventually moving on to using rabbits and then monkeys. Whenever they had a successful test result, Harry would go on and on about it, and how it was going to make his career. There was only one time when something had gone really wrong, and Harry had been quite down about the mission. Rohan couldn't recall exactly what the particular experiment was, but they had to incinerate most of the lab animals because of it. And he recalled that the research team had haunted looks on their faces for several days after. Rohan's memories were really beginning to flood back now. The corporation was attempting to pioneer a teleportation device that could potentially allow mass colonization of several nearby habitable planets, each several hundred light years away. However, due to the highly experimental and dangerous nature of the prototype, the company was required to conduct its testing millions of miles away from inhabited areas, which is where the Shining Spear came in. The Spear was a science vessel, but the combined power of its engines was capable of providing the incredible amount of energy needed for Harry's meat-shifting device. The same amount of energy that could wipe out all life across the Earth should something go wrong. Murdoch, the Spear's chief engineer, often referred to her power source as the Eye of Sauron, an impossibly small black hole suspended in a quantum field generator. Rohan had no idea how any of that actually worked, but Murdoch's idiomatic description stuck with him. There were many grab handles on all parts of the engineering room, the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Deep space vessel engineering rooms were designed symmetrically in all directions that way, being at the very center, the very heart of the ship. In zero gravity, which way is up or down is determined by the facing of the vessel, and whether it is in constant acceleration or deceleration. With the Spear in some kind of dead, aimless state, there was no up or down. In the half-darkness, and with the long shadows cast by his flashlight, the room took on an eerie vision, like the inside of an immense cathedral. Using the last of his waning strength and fighting through a firestorm of aches and pains in his body, Rohan finally made it to the center console. He sluggishly pulled himself toward the control panel and saw the familiar Laohu Industries logo on the housing for the power reboot switch. He prized open the panel with his right hand, paused to catch one more labored breath, then pulled the switch. For a second there was nothing, but then the hydraulics murmured. Rohan felt the familiar vibrations through the handle he was struggling to hold onto with his left hand. It was the recognizable hum of the power grid. Lights flickered into brightness, and a low-frequency throb ran through the whole ship as the engines powered up. The display screen above the console turned on and began blinking there in bright white letters. "Engines operational," it read. Rohan pulled himself closer to the console keypad and, mustering all of his concentration, carefully typed in Protocol 18, followed by his name, crew designation, and his 10-digit command code. He hit execute and waited for the Spear's AI to handle the rest. He had been feeling much worse over the last few minutes. The medgel didn't seem to do anything anymore, if it ever did. A new message appeared on the display screen. It read, Protocol 18 confirmed. Despite all the pain he was still in, now Rohan could relax and let go. Dancing, quivering spheres of red droplets formed a slow, moving, arcing trail as he let go of the handle and slunk away from the console. He could see the lighted digits on the display panel getting smaller and smaller as he floated farther out. He didn't need to see them, he knew what they were. The AI was counting down. He couldn't hear the audible count, but he could see the red and orange emergency flashing lights that pointed the way to the escape pod. His head hurt. He had no use for those lights. He was starting to lose consciousness, and he'd never make it in time anyway. And then he remembered. Levana. The AI's name was Levana. He was floating involuntarily back to the corridor outside the engineering room. When he got there, he looked up along it toward the medical bay. There were red and orange lights along the wall leading the way to the escape pod. No use to him now. His tired limbs floated around him limply as he slowly rotated feet overhead. He wished he could make his body move toward the escape pod, but he'd pushed himself beyond all capacity already. The throbbing pain in his head was unbearable. He concentrated on his slow, wanting breaths. He continued rotating until he could see up towards the medical bay again. There was movement. Rohan blinked frantically. Blood was seeping into the side of his eyes, which made it difficult for him to see. There were arms, several of them, and legs. A giant torso was being pulled and pushed by many grasping, flailing limbs. It seemed a heavy, lumbering mass even in this weightless environment. The way it moved, like it was suffering, but it was desperate to live. Arms and legs folding and then unfolding, reaching out as it felt its way along the corridor. Its many hands grasping, searching for anything for it to find purchase with. An abomination, he thought. But no matter. The spear would implode in only a few more seconds. He rotated one full cycle again, just in time to see the last few flailing limbs disappear into the escape pod. It was escaping. The monstrosity was escaping. "Levana!" he cried out, using the very last of his strength and breath. "Abort!" The whole ship began shaking violently. A bright white light. Then nothing. The next thing Rohan saw was a shiny reflection of his own face, with black eyes, a bandaged, swollen head, and about 4 days of stubble. He closed his eyes again. Blackness. Dreams of being home on his father's ranch. One of the stallions had gotten loose and they were riding out to find him. Then snow was falling. His mother's face barely visible as the snow fell. She was calling to him, "Ro! Ro! Time to wake up!" Time to wake up. A high-resolution digital voice snapped him out of his dream. Rohan sat up, frantically looking around to understand where he was. He clutched at the blanket that was tucked in around him up to his waist. But then, he relaxed his hands. He was safe. He was alive. And safe. He recognized the room he was in. It was the executive quarters of the Shining Spear. It was an area of the ship rarely used during missions, and was normally only used when dignitaries or a senior director wished to observe a mission or hitch a ride from one planet to another or to one of the corporation's orbital stations. Crewman waits. You are recovering from a life-threatening head injury. You must remain calm and rest. The source of the digital voice was a 6-foot-tall bipedal automaton. It was the avatar that activated in emergencies that would allow Levana to perform any necessary tasks if any of the crew became incapacitated. Take these. The automaton stretched out a hand toward Rohan and he took the 2 pain pills. He was also handed a cup of water. Rohan paused for a second before popping the pills and taking a drink to wash them down with. Looking at his reflection in the shiny chrome panel of the robot's chest, he realized he was smiling. Thanks, Levana. You saved my life. A few hours later, Rohan was feeling well enough to resume his duties and was clearing up some of the detritus around his workstation on the bridge. He was grateful for the artificial gravity being generated by the accelerating motion of the ship as it headed towards Earth. Levana had already activated the journey home several days ago as part of standard protocol. Levana, Rohan called out. You have to notify the company about what happened to the rest of the crew. They already know, she replied.